Hello and welcome to my channel, bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a review for Native Tongue by Suzette Haydn Elgin. Now this book was published in 1984, around the same time as The Handmaid's Tale was published, and just like The Handmaid's Tale, this is basically a feminist dystopia, though with a greater science fictional element to it, and a special focus on the role of linguistics in female liberation, shall we say. Now, this is one of the more recent publications in the Science Fiction Masterworks collection, and it's also the first volume in a trilogy, something which I wasn't aware of when I went into it, but only the first volume is currently available as a science fiction masterworks. So I said a feminist dystopia with greater emphasis on science fiction and the power of language and, again, linguistic relativity, though specifically in relation to female liberation / feminism. More specifically, we are about 200 years in the future. The story starts in 2205, and well, the government of the United States, and perhaps governments around the world, that's never really specified, has repealed the Ninth Amendment, which gave the vote to women. So women cannot work, own property without the permission of their fathers or their husbands. It's a very depressing setting if you're female or you care about your fellow female human beings. What's also particular about the future is that human beings have colonized other planets or, planetary-like bodies, and they've come into contact with several alien species. And to communicate with said alien species, they employ the skills of linguists. Linguists have become something more than people who write books or teach at universities. They're like business brokers, they're like ambassadors, they're the interface between humanity and these alien species, so they wield a lot of power, and if you want to have anything done with these alien species, you have to go through the linguists, and the linguists are grouped into 13 families called the lines. It really takes a close look at how these lines function, and obviously how the women of the lines live their lives, and how, this systematic sex-based oppression affects them specifically. I honestly don't have anything specific to say about the writing. It was alright. It worked. There was like a classic, older science fiction vibe to it. It was fairly fast-paced, and that was a good thing. It really kept me engaged with the story, and there's a fair bit of technical or field-specific language to do with, well, linguistics and the processes of language acquisition and language learning, especially in young children. And something which I enjoyed about the way this novel was written is that at the beginning of each chapter, there's a header section that either features, an excerpt from a book written in the future, a poetry excerpt, a quotation from an imaginary symposium, and these serve as exposition tools to provide some world-building context, etc. And also, bits of feminist reflection, things like that. But I think that was pretty well done. Now, the way the story is structured is the first chapter takes place in 2205, like I said, but then the story starts from 40 years before that to bring you back towards the present day, which was a wee bit confusing for a minute there at the beginning, but then it was fine. It's also told from, I would say, 3 or 4 separate points of view, and there are 2 parallel plot lines going on. One which more or less follows the life of a woman of the linguistic lines. And this then also includes the point of view of the head of this line from which this female character comes from, Chorniak household, but also acts as basically the leader of all the linguistic lines. And the other parallel plot line to this is a team of scientists appointed by the army. Their job is to figure out a way of communicating with a non-humanoid alien species. So they separate in this universe between human-like and non-human-like aliens. Linguists have figured out a way of basically communicating with the human-like alien species because they say, since they're human-like, they use similar processes for, well, language development. This does not apply to non-human-like aliens. But guess what? The government and the army, they want to crack that. And they're doing all sorts of ethically questionable, to say the least, experiments to, figure it out. And there's some back and forth going on with the linguistic lines, who see their hold on, trading power, etc., potentially threatened by the government. Because the linguistic lines are not the government. They are a separate, independent entity, and so there's definite animosity between those groups, especially since the linguistic lines are also shunned and discriminated against by the rest of the general population. At its core, this is a story of resistance and slow mounting rebellion or revolution, but mostly resistance. This is not a book in which a lot of action takes place. And fair warning, the end is a wee bit frustrating, but keeping in mind that this is the first book in a trilogy, that probably makes some sense. I mean, if this was a standalone, I would be a lot more annoyed by the ending because there isn't that much of a resolution overall. But it is definitely a story of resistance. So there are several points of view, as I just mentioned. Let's start with the person I think is in a way the main character of the novel, though the story starts off, sort of, if you put aside that very first chapter, which takes place in the future, with a very young girl. She's like 7 or 8 at the beginning of the story, and she is Nazareth Chorniak, a daughter of the Chorniak household, which is one of the most important linguistic lines. Nazareth is, I think, a fairly headstrong child. She has a strong, resilient spirit, but what's really special about her is that it's established early on by the women of her family that she's extremely gifted in languages. Now, all the children of these linguist lines have an amazing aptitude for language. I mean, they're put, as soon as they're like a few months old, into intensive language learning programs. They're put into what are called interfaces with humanoid alien species so they can directly learn to speak what the aliens speak, and then they have to learn several different human languages from different linguistic groupings and have to study grammar and syntax, etc., etc. It's like they're studying for multiple linguistic PhDs since the time they can walk, basically. But she's particularly gifted, and this is recognized by specifically the women of the Baron House. The Baron House is a very important element of the story because this is where all the women who are no longer able to bear children go to live out the rest of their lives, though they still work for their respective linguist families, but they don't have to live with men anymore. They live amongst themselves. So there is a note of female separatism in there, which I'll get back to. It also affords them a certain amount of freedom with which they are working on their resistance movement, and, as is suggested, eventually their liberation movement. And so they're working on an exclusively female language, and they see that Nazareth will be key to developing and fine-tuning that language. Then you have Michaela Landry, and, well, so she gets married off because, of course, you have marital academies and, matrimonial agencies that will find, for any man, the perfect, stereotypical 1950s housewife for him. But in fact, she wants none of this crap. Something happens to her child, and she kills her husband, and her idea is that she's going to get back at the linguists who she thinks were responsible for the death of a child, and so she wants to be, what they call an angel of mercy, so a nurse who in secret kills her patients. So she volunteers to go work at home for elderly linguists. And you have the main male character, the main male presence, Thomas Chorniak. He is Nazareth's father, and he's the head of Chorniak household and de facto the head of all the linguist lines. This is a man with a huge amount of power, and while he's not overly sadistic or cruel, he's an asshole. He's an asshole, he's just cold and calculated, sees women in terms of profit, of maximizing the amount of languages they know and with which they can negotiate trade agreements, etc. And then you have this team of scientists I mentioned who are desperately trying to crack communication with non-humanoid aliens under the direction of a secret military program loosely associated with the government. And I mean, it's It's kind of a stereotypical bunch of frustrated, nerdy scientists who are very frustrated about not being able to crack this. But yeah, I mean, there's a bit of humor going on there. And they have to interact with Thomas Chorniak because that convinced the linguists know something they don't. That they know a secret about the way they train their children to learn all these languages. And they say, no, there's nothing special about this. It's just shoving a child very early on into a language-rich environment because, you know, babies are sponges. It's pretty common sense. It's easier to learn things when you're very young, and that's what they're working off of, really. And they say, you know, you can do this as any kind of child, but no, the government is convinced that there's something special going on with their genetics or something. Overall, though, the characterization in this novel isn't that deep, isn't that fleshed out. I think this is more a plot-driven story than a character-driven one. Now I'd like to take a closer look at the world building overall. I was, and this is going to sound weird, a bit worried because I'd read that there was no overt sexual violence in this book, which I'm sure a lot of readers will be very happy with. I mean, this is not an actual criticism. I was just worried that it wouldn't be that credible because, you know, in a highly misogynistic society, there is sexual violence. That's kind of a given. So the comment I'd read said there wasn't any of that in there. True. Happily enough, it still works. It's still credible as a horribly oppressive, abusive society towards women. And again, I know it sounds weird to be happy that that's well portrayed, but I mean, it's a feminist dystopia, that's kind of the point in a way. Be so scary that we make sure this never happens. Despite that, it is still a violent society in a way, because, I mean, if you think about it, women in this world, especially linguist women, they have to bear like 8, 9, 10 children during their lives, because the point is to produce lots of children which they can shove into interfaces and into these intensive language learning programs. You need a lot of babies to do that because you need to accumulate all these new languages all the time. It's like the embodiment of, you know, Marx and Engels' theory about the nuclear family and producing workers. I mean, literally. So women are forced to breed like chattel. And of course, you know, they don't get to choose who they marry, right? They're married off to a man that will suit the trading arrangements between the linguistic families and, you know, what kind of languages they can add to the roster and that kind of thing. And they get married off very young. They explain that it's been getting younger and younger as time has gone by because, once again, they need to be producing a lot of these babies as soon as they can. So they get married off at 16. Nazareth gets married off at 15. So, in a way, that is sexually violent. Now, one issue I do have with the world building is that I don't really think the way this misogynistic society came about is terribly credible. They just say that at some point, male scientists proved that women were intellectually inferior. And that's it. I'm like, all right, but can you develop that idea a wee bit more? Because that's a bit vague. And so that led to the 19th, I'm sorry, I said 9th previously, I was wrong. It's the 19th Amendment being repealed. And also, it's never really specified whether or not that applies to the rest of planet Earth. So that also was a bit vague. An interesting thing I already mentioned is that apparently racism has disappeared, because there's a direct quote that says, you know, oh, once we used to judge a man on the color of his skin. Well, now all men are united in their belittlement of their fellow females. Yay for progress, right? But instead of racism, you have this societal divide between regular people and the linguists. Again, it's never really explained why. They do touch upon the fact that people think the linguists live in extreme luxury because, you know, they make a lot of money through their monopoly on communicating with aliens and arranging trade deals for various governments. But in fact, they don't live in luxury. They live pretty frugally, pretty modestly, because they want to maintain, ironically, an image of being beyond board, because they have been attacked and have suffered from violence at the hands of the general public. So they're walking that fine line. Ironically, they wield a lot of power, but they don't use it that much. They don't revel in it. They're not doing it for material gain. The men are really doing it for the sheer power of it, I think. I mean, that's how I perceived it. And so the women, you know, they have to almost beg for decorations in their homes. They have to ask for money to plant a few flowers here and there. And actually, the men of the lines are pretty stingy overall. One other problem I have is that And it is pretty, not necessarily typical, but it's not that surprising coming from a more or less second wave feminist writer. It is a bit disappointing. All the male characters are shite. All of them. There's not one nice male character. I mean, there is one who sort of tries to plead in Nazareth's favor to allow her to have, breast reconstruction surgery, because he says, but, she gave the family a lot of children, and they say, no, men planted the children in her womb and she did her duty. So he kind of tries to defend her, but all of the men are shit. They are. They're all assholes. They're all misogynistic and entitled. Even the one guy who seems to act in a polite and respectful manner towards Nazareth as she's working on a linguist case. He consults her on, difficult items of grammar, of alien grammar, and he offers her a rose. And so she falls madly in love with him because she's pretty young and naive. And then he basically tattles on her to her dad. And then you've got a scene where he shames the crap out of her. And the thing is, she's already been married for 4 years, but she's only 19 years old. And her husband is just a massive dick who makes fun of her all the time. And he just laughs at this. He's not even offended or jealous. He just thinks she's ridiculous and stupid. And she's just shamed. And of course, the father, whilst not outright screaming at her, he does coldly threaten her, you do this again, we'll sterilize you and send you to an insane asylum and we'll lobotomize you, basically. All the men are like that. Even in The Handmaid's Tale, you do have men who are concerned about the women in their lives and who just, see women as people. And here, all the men are crap. Theme-wise now, I think you have already a general idea of what this is fundamentally about. Yes, it's about sex-based oppression. All right, but let's dig into that a little bit. What makes this book special and interesting versus something like The Handmaid's Tale or others in that genre is, well, first, you have this big plot focus on human-alien interactions. I mean, this is squarely within the domain of science fiction proper, not just dystopia. And, well, I would say a feminist spin on the, once again, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or the hypothesis of linguistic relativity. Though I think within the cadre of feminist thinking, the idea of a female-exclusive language, so this big project all the women of the Baron houses are working on, something that would allow women to speak specifically about their experiences and about their bodies, which are seen as something dirty, shameful. They really believe that having words only they will understand to talk about their experience will liberate them. And this is an idea that has actually existed within the frame of feminist theory and feminist analysis, especially within French-speaking feminism. So names that come to mind are Julia Kristeva, Hélène Cixous, or Luce Irigaray, a Belgian, like me. They were women who thought about, female language and creating even female-specific language with which they could write novels and poetry that would directly reflect the female experience, this idea of woman-identified woman, which is also a concept in English language feminism, to have their own words and not just use the words of the oppressor, man, but words that would belong to women, that would not be tainted or used against them. So that's an interesting idea. I'd never seen it expressed in fiction, so that was cool, and I would assume that it's developed even further in books 2 and 3. I mean, you only get a glimpse at the seedlings of this language. And so this also asks the fundamental question of how do you initiate the process of liberation? There's the long game approach and there's the short-term approach. Short-term approach would be something like revolution, even violent revolution, which you could have through separatism. And this is something mentioned in this book. Obviously, you have the pseudo-separatism of the Baron houses, which allows women to live with one another and cultivate compassion, understanding, the seeds of, future revolution. They're running, secret abortion clinics and contraception clinics. They have, herbs and stuff hanging around, and they have all these works of feminist thought from the 20th century and movies and things they keep hidden in the Baron houses. So the idea of, separatism as a path to liberation is definitely floating around in there in some form. Of course, this is a very contentious idea. I'm not in favor of separatism at all personally, but it is part of feminist history. But you could contrast to that a more long-term approach, which implicates education. Educating the younger generations to think differently, and this brings us right back to this female language. That this new language will allow little girls to think differently about themselves. And if they can think differently about themselves and about the messages they've been receiving from the men in their lives, well, they can start thinking about the world differently and even imagining a different world. Again, language influencing reality. And I think another sub-theme also related to, this major theme of sex-based oppression, you do have this notion of intersectionality, because you do see that there isn't any racism, but this is replaced by this conflict between the general population and the lines. So, for example, Michaela Landry, at first, she finds herself superior to the women of the lines. She thinks the men of the lines are crap and she wants them gone. But what's sad and infuriating is that she thinks that women are even worse. It's bad enough that she thinks that just because someone is a linguist, they're somehow an inferior human. The women are even worse. And it's this divide and conquer approach, which is beautifully illustrated in, once again, The Handmaid's Tale, is that, well, as a woman, Michaela is at the bottom of the ladder in her specific part of the population. But at least she's not a linguist woman. She's better than those women, and I can look down upon them and make myself feel better. It is a hierarchy of oppression and abuse, which is what intersectionality is all about. Recognizing that some people are actually not necessarily on the same level because they suffer from different kinds of discrimination, oppression, etc. It also shows the interaction between the personal and the societal/political, because you cannot separate what's going on with the women, specifically, once again, the women of the lines, and what's going on in the wider world. This vast expansion of humanity into space, its interaction with alien species, is one of the major driving forces of the oppression specifically experienced by the women of the lines. I mean, women in general society, they go to marital academies, they don't have the same kind of education, they're not allowed to be lawyers, doctors, etc. They cannot own income without the authorization of their fathers, brothers, husbands, etc. So they don't have a great life either, and they're considered to be frivolous, superficial creatures who are interested in being pretty. Or they're encouraged to be pretty to snag a good husband. I mean, again, this is feminism 101. But the women of the lines, it's even worse for them because they're married off as soon as they can breed. And they're not overtly forced. But you know what I mean? They're forced to have 8, 9, 10 children, as much as they can carry. So obviously, that particular aspect of their oppressive experience is a direct result of the wider societal context that is just driving forward to expansion and acquiring resources and having more and more extravagant lifestyles. And to protect themselves from violence, they have to actually be pretty modest and not own many things. They have 2 different outfits for the year, and they can't have decorations in their houses, and they work all the time. Their schedules are insane. Even the schedules of their children are insane. They have to work as soon as they can walk. They work until they die, or they go to the barren houses. But for some of them, the males, they get the prestige, they get to do those trade arrangements, they get that raw power, which is the main appeal. So final thoughts before I read some quotes. I thought this was a good novel. I was happily surprised in a way. I was kept engaged in this book, actually. I was like, I want to know what's going to happen next. I'm even somewhat tempted to read the other 2 novels, but it's hard to find them secondhand. Also, minor concern, I admit, they are not currently available in the Science Fiction Masterworks collection. I would really like them to be honest, so I could have a matching set. If that ever happens, I will consider reading the other 2, though I have read that the second volume is as good as this one, but the third kind of dives off a cliff. So, I would rather just stay on an overall good impression on this one. It's far from perfect. Like I've said, I've pointed out a few problems with the world building, lack of characterization, and that very rigid feminist approach, which was characteristic of some second wavers, not all. That female separatist element, which is, again, I can understand it from a historical point of view, but it's just really not my thing. And then this overly negative characterization of every single male character, that was just a bit overkill for me. But I'm glad I read it. It's part of the feminist SFF canon. As such, I think it has definite value. So yeah, I mean, if you like the genre, honestly, give it a go. I think it's a worthwhile experience. And now I shall read some of the quotes I wrote down. He had marvelled that man could so turn against his own kind and could excuse such brutality for a reason that was no reason. Once, for the colour of a man's skin. Now, for whether a man came out of the households of 13 families of this world, out of the lines. We are men, and human words are all we have. Even the word of God is composed actually of the words of men. Everybody perceives stuff. Everybody makes up statements about it. Everybody, so far as we can tell, agrees enough to get by so that when I say, hand me the coffee, you know what to hand me. And that's reality. People get used to a certain kind of reality and come to expect it. And if what they perceive doesn't fit the set of statements everybody's agreed to, either the culture has to go through a kind of fit until it adjusts, or they just blank it out. A prisoner hears, you are sentenced to life. Nazareth felt that now, more sharply than she had ever had to feel it before. But she would learn. Every woman was a prisoner for life. It was not some burden that she bore uniquely. She would have all the company she could ever need. Women hurting other women, that was ugly. And it hurt her because they were deformed of spirit through no fault of their own, and there was nothing whatsoever that she could do to help them. In the abashed silence, she added, any beginning is also an ending, you know. You can't have just the one. Like most women, she had suffered one violent case of the romantic love that everyone learned about in homeroom and had spoon-fed to them, with a giant spoon, by the media, when she was very young. And like most women, that one case had cured her for life. And that was my review for Native Tongue by Suzette Haydn Elgin. Next time I will be doing a review of another feminist SFF classic. Is it already a classic? I'm not sure, but it's published in the Science Fiction Masterworks collection, so I'm going to go with that. Ammonite by Nicola Griffith. In the meantime, I hope you will have a lovely day or evening. Keep yourselves safe in these particular times, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye!